Hello there, wicked listeners, and welcome to the newly revived Wicked Crimes. I know I've been missing for a few years, but life happens, and now it's time for a return. And this return comes with a whole bunch of changes. Wicked Crimes is undergoing a rebrand. We've dropped the South African focus and will now look into crimes from all over the world. However, South African crimes will remain our largest focus. We are also now somewhat sponsored. Yes, Wicked Crimes is now brought to you by Clear Design. So, what does this mean for you? Well, not much really. The sponsorship mostly impacts me. I now have some more time to devote to the podcast, access to extra resources, software, and even hardware. That being said, I retain full control over the podcast, and I still don't get paid for it. For the most part, the podcast is still a one-man team. Finally, our logo is getting redesigned, and one day soon we'll have a website you can visit. But I'll give you more information on that as and when it happens. Now, if you're new to the podcast, you might be wondering what the hell I'm talking about. This is the first episode on your feed. The reason for this is that Wicked Crimes used to be Wicked Crimes South Africa on a completely different channel. I unfortunately took a very long hiatus from podcasting, and I lost access to that channel, and it has been removed from all podcasting platforms as far as I know. If you do see Wicked Crimes South Africa still pop up somewhere, please let me know. Now, that is about all the logistics we need to cover before we can get into our first case, the murder of Rhonda Sue Warford.
Please be advised that this podcast contains content that could be harmful to some listeners. This includes, but is not limited to, strong language and graphic descriptions of violence, sexual activities, assault, and death. This podcast also engages in discussion regarding various religions, spiritual beliefs, and practices, some of which might be harmful or triggering for some listeners. Please reconsider before consuming this content. The information contained within this podcast is mainly gathered from news articles and official court documents where available. Should you have any more information, or if you know of any incorrect information in this content, please feel free to contact the host through the email found in the show notes.
Hi, I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, host of the True Crime South Africa podcast and true crime author. My new book, Bare Bones, is out in stores now. In Bare Bones, I re-examine missing person and murder cases I've covered in my podcast series and revisit the leads I tracked and the interviews I conducted. Much of the information has never been made public before. From the bones of a Jane Doe discovered under a swimming pool, to a troubled young man who seemed to vanish into the prison system. From a business trip turned deadly to a child snatched from outside her home, I sift through the evidence anew and shine a light on old and new unsolved cases in the hope of bringing closure to victims' families and friends. Join me in the search for the truth behind the scenes of the podcast desk. Bare Bones is available in all bookstores and on Amazon and other online platforms in ebook format. The audiobook is also coming soon.
When I cover a case, I try to find as much information as I can on the victim in the case. The purpose of this podcast is twofold. The main aim of the podcast is to give a voice to the victim. But that's not always possible. This case is one of those where the victim's memory gets lost to the complexity of the case. Secondarily, I try and use this space to educate the general public on how claims of the occult, especially when they are unfounded, can negatively impact a case, its investigation, and yes, even its outcome. Now you might be wondering why I would cover a case if I can't give a victim a voice. Well, something happened to me quite recently. In fact, it was while I was busy with this case. Without going into too much detail, I was unfortunate enough to witness a horrible event that resulted in someone losing their life. At the end of it, I did not even know the name of the person who lost their life. However, the entire event, the handling of it by the media afterward, and the public reaction to it, all taught me a valuable lesson. I gained insight that until now I've not really been exposed to. The person whose name and life I had no clue of has left a legacy that has impacted the way I will be covering cases going forward. They left a lasting impression on me without me even knowing a thing about them. If covering cases like the one I am about to cover means that it might just change the perspective of one person in the future, it means that the victim in this case did not lose their life completely in vain. They are leaving their own type of legacy, and maybe, just maybe, their cases can help us to prevent future cases from happening. Before we continue, I just want to give you a warning that this case is unsolved, and there are parts of it that is technically still ongoing. While I don't normally cover cases that are still ongoing, you'll understand why I decided to cover this case by the end of it. You see, while I mostly prefer to cover solved cases, there is also an importance in covering unsolved cases. We have a lot to learn from them. And of course, someone, somewhere, knows something. If you are listening to this case, and you realize you might have information that could help to bring justice for the victim and their family, please contact your local authorities and share that information with them, no matter how irrelevant you think it might be. And if you are scared of having your name connected to it, please look into ways to anonymously tip off your local police department. I could not find enough information on the family of the victim in this case to contact them before covering this case. If you're a family member of the victim and you realize I might have gotten something wrong, or you just want to share more of Rhonda Sue Warford's story with me, please feel free to contact me immediately. I will be happy to correct any information I might have gotten wrong at the request of loved ones. But now, let's get into the case. The year is 1992. 19-year-old Rhonda Sue Warford, a graduate from the Iroquois High School, is living with her family in Louisville, Kentucky. For the past 5 months, she had been in an on-again and off-again relationship with her boyfriend, 22-year-old Gar Keith Harden. On Wednesday, the 1st of April, 1992, Rhonda Sue borrowed a pair of red sweatpants from her mother. She put on her white tennis shoes, a dark blue shirt, grabbed her multicolored jacket, and around 7 p.m., she headed out the door. Rhonda was on her way down to a local Kroger, which for those of us not from the US, is a grocery store. Rhonda Sue and some of her friends would meet at this Kroger quite regularly and basically just hang out in the parking lot. This was the early 90s, a time before smartphones, computers, and all other antisocial aspects of modern life that we now enjoy. So meeting up with friends and hanging out in a grocery shop parking lot would not have been too strange, I think. Half an hour later, however, Rhonda was back at home. She told her mother that there had been a strange man at the parking lot who had made her feel uncomfortable. This man had apparently been harassing her, even telling her that he wanted to marry her. Neither woman thought much of it, and they continued with their night back at home. Around midnight, Rhonda Sue decided to go back to the parking lot and meet up with her friends again, thinking that the man will probably have moved on by now. By the next morning, her mother realized that Rhonda Sue had not returned home. She immediately knew that something was wrong, and she reported Rhonda Sue as missing. You might think this is odd, especially given the fact that Rhonda Sue had gone out at midnight. However, take a moment and think of the people closest to you. All of us have normal behavior and a routine, even if we don't actively follow it. It's clear that Rhonda Sue would have either been back in the morning or have left some kind of notice for her mother that she would be out. The lack of this makes it plausible for her mother to be extremely concerned, especially since there had been a strange man that had bothered Rhonda Sue so much the previous night that she had thought it safer to return home. There is also a myth, largely spurred on by entertainment television, that has many people believing that someone needs to be missing for 24 hours before they can be reported missing. This is not true. Anyone can be reported missing immediately, especially when there is extra reason for concern, like in this case. Rhonda Sue's mother and her family did not waste time. They immediately sprang to action and started calling family and friends, looking for any information on where Rhonda Sue could have been. They also posted missing posters all around town. While talking to the police, her mother did what any mother would do in this situation. She started to think about everything and everyone in her daughter's life that could in any way be connected to her disappearance. And there was something that stood out to her. She had been hearing that the man her daughter had been dating, Garkeith Harden, and his friend, Jeffrey Clark, had both been involved in Satanism. They had apparently even used a needle and thread to sew a tattoo of an upside-down cross into Rhonda Sue's left collarbone. Now, this was in the midst of what we call the Satanic Panic. In a future episode, I will take a closer look at what the Satanic Panic is, how it started, and how it is still very much alive today. For now, it is important to keep in mind that the 90s were the peak of the Satanic Panic. This was a time where heavily Christian communities were certain that young people were being seduced into Satanism at mass through mediums such as rock music, TV shows, books, and basically any other medium that they can think of that does not carry the approval of the church. This meant that symbolism such as the inverted cross by this time had already moved away from being a Christian symbol and instead being incorrectly connected to Satanism. You might be surprised that the inverted cross is actually a Christian symbol. In fact, earlier this year, the inverted cross made an appearance at the Pope's funeral, where it also sparked claims of satanic connections in the Vatican itself. In reality, the inverted cross is actually called the Cross of St. Peter. In the 1st century, when the Apostle Peter was to be crucified by the Roman Emperor Nero, he requested to be crucified upside down because he felt he was not worthy to die in the same way as Jesus. From there, the symbol was ingrained in Christianity. It was only with the rise of Hollywood that I can find this symbol actually started taking on a different meaning. To understand this, you need to understand a bit of movie magic. A movie is generally an hour and a half long, and depending on the story, they need to fit months or even years of story into that hour and a half. To do so, they need to be able to convey certain messages without ever saying a word. This is where symbolism and imagery play an important part. But now, you have another problem. The message you are trying to convey to your audience needs to be clear so that those watching catches on quite quickly, even if they do not consciously realize it. The easiest way of doing this is using well-known symbols, and if needed, changing these symbols in a way that can easily change the meaning in an understandable way. Do you see where I'm going with this? What is the most well-known Christian symbol? A cross. And it's safe to assume that in a way, at least to the average person, Satanism is the exact opposite of Christianity. Well, at least the type of Satanism we are referring to here. So if you take the cross as a symbol of Christianity, what is the easiest way to show the exact opposite of it? By turning it upside down. And thus, the upside-down cross suddenly is no longer a Christian symbol, but rather an anti-Christian symbol. The inverted cross has indeed been used as a satanic symbol. Some institutions, like the Church of Satanism and the Satanic Temple, have at times used the inverted cross. But this is not a very popular symbol in Satanism. Its main use is still in movies or on the cover of music albums. But back to the case. For 3 days, Rhonda Sue's family looked for her without any luck. Then, on the 5th of April, an elderly couple looking for real estate in Meade County, about 50 miles or 80 kilometers from Louisville, discovered what they initially thought was a mannequin. On further inspection, they could clearly see it was a body. Police were called in, and the body was positively identified as that of Rhonda Sue Warford. Rhonda Sue's body was discovered laying face down in a wooded area. She was still dressed in the clothing she had left her house with on the 1st of April. Her multicolored jacket, her blue shirt, her white tennis shoes, and her mom's red sweatpants. She had suffered several stab wounds to her back as well as to her chest. There was evidence of defensive wounds on her hands. The medical examiner would later determine that the fatal wound was a stab wound to the base of her skull, which had severed her brainstem. During my research into the case, I could not find any information on whether her body was moved there or if this was the primary crime scene. From what I can gather, it does seem like this was the primary crime scene. Unfortunately, police still did not find much evidence here. What they did find were hairs on her hands and pants, which they believed belonged to her attacker. The investigation now changed from a missing person investigation to a murder investigation and was chaired by the Louisville PD and the Meade County Sheriff's Department. Based on the complexity of the crime and the apparent lack of evidence at the scene, Louisville Metro PD Detective Mike Handy was assigned as lead detective to the case. You see, Detective Handy had a great reputation. He was known as an excellent closer. This meant that he had a unique ability to solve extremely hard cases. He usually did this by getting confessions. Yes, Detective Handy had a gift to find just the right evidence to point him to the guilty party. And from there, he managed to get confessions good enough to close the case and get a successful prosecution. The investigation immediately started to focus on Rhonda Sue's boyfriend and the claims that he was involved in Satanism along with his friend Jeffrey. Police interviewed the two men. When asked about their whereabouts on the night that Rhonda Sue disappeared, both men said that they had spent the night together at Jeffrey Clark's residence, where they had drunk beer and spent a good portion of the night looking for a snake that had belonged to Clark. When asked when they had last seen Rhonda Sue, Harden said that he had seen her on the 29th of March, 3 days prior to her going missing, and that they had spent the night at her place. He did admit that he spoke to her via telephone on the day of her disappearance. Clark, on the other hand, claimed that he had not seen her since December of 1991, about 4 months prior. My research was unclear regarding whether the investigators managed to obtain a warrant or whether the men agreed to it, but in any case, their hair samples were collected and compared to those found on Rhonda Sue's body. Jeffrey Clark's car was also searched. In Clark's car, they discovered a fingerprint that belonged to Rhonda Sue. Clark claimed that it must have been there for months. As part of a continuing investigation, both Harden and Clark's homes were searched as well. Here, investigators found multiple knives, and in Harden's home, they found a copy of the Satanic Bible, as well as other occult-related items. Unfortunately, none of the documentation I used as research for this case mentioned exactly what these items were, but they do include what investigators described as a broken chalice and a handkerchief stained with blood. On the 5th of May 1992, both men were arrested and indicted for aggravated murder. The motive was believed to be a satanic sacrifice with the purpose of obtaining more power. Now, you may feel like I've charged through the investigation so far. In a way, I have. We'll look into the investigation a bit more when we start looking into the court case. But before we do, I do want to take a moment and look at the so-called occult-related items that were found in Harden's home. I really wish the documents had been clearer on what these items were. The reason for that is quite simple. Occult-related items could mean a wide variety of things. For example, if you look at my home right now, you would find multiple items that can be seen as occult-related. I have a little Baphomet crocheted plushie. That does not mean I'm engaged in the occult. It just means my boyfriend knows I like weird things, and he found this cute toy on his travels and brought it back to me as a souvenir. Heck, I even have a copy of the Satanic Bible, which I plan on reading as research. I have multicolored candles, because they make up the gay flag. I have other candles, because I live in South Africa, and our power supply is about as reliable as our politicians. I have several skull decorations, because again, I like weird stuff. Heck, even this podcast and all the research for it might make people think I'm not only interested in the cult, but actively participating. This does not mean that finding occult-related items in a home cannot point to occult interests. It just means that more often than not, investigators see these items and make incorrect assumptions based on a bias caused by their own religion or mainstream media. By the end of the episode, you'll understand what I mean. The other thing I'd like to take a moment to look at is the supposed motive that Detective Handy put forth for the murder of Rhonda Sue. Detective Handy claimed that Harden and Clark had sacrificed Rhonda Sue in order to obtain more power. This is the same motivation used in almost every other satanic murder case I've come across. The belief is that by sacrificing another person, the person performing the act will be rewarded in some way. While I'm sure there are people that believe this, I have one major question about it. If candles, chalices, aphemes, and all other so-called satanic tools and symbolism are so important? Why are they never present in these attacks? If these murders are ritualistic in nature, where are the ritualistic elements? It's not unreasonable to assume that a religion that focuses so much on a ritualistic activity that the perpetrators always have some sort of ritualistic paraphernalia would also require that ritualistic acts such as these be committed in accordance with some sort of ritual, especially when done as a type of agreement with their deity. Of course, there is the possibility that the ritual aspect of this occurs at a different time, like before or after the murder. I will concede to that, and let's for a moment assume that this is the case. I just wanted to make this point, and this is a point I want you to keep in mind anytime you hear Satanism or the occult as a motive for murder. Now, as we look further into the case, I will be referring back to parts of the investigation, as this will become an extremely important part of the ongoing court proceedings. The two men were arraigned on the 6th of May 1992. They would then proceed to have a joint trial. However, before the trial even started, a woman had testified before a Meade County special grand jury. During this testimony, she told the grand jury that a man had picked Rhonda Sue up and that he had driven her to Meade County. While there, he had gotten into an argument with Rhonda Sue and then proceeded to murder her. Now, I have no idea who this woman is or where she had gotten her information from. She did name the man that she alleged had done this. But because nothing has ever been proved against him, and some evidence which we will get to later do not actively prove his involvement, I will not be using his name. It is, however, important to note that at the time the evidence had not yet been tested, and I would expect the investigating police force to follow up on the testimony that this woman had made. Testifying in front of a special grand jury is a very scary experience, and the setting is very intimidating towards the person testifying. That alone should add enough weight to the testimony to justify an investigation. And if the investigation shows that the person had made a false testimony, I feel that they should be punished for the vast amount of resources they wasted. The fact of the matter is that in an investigation like this, no stone should be left unturned. I would much rather see an investigation done too thoroughly than not at all. At the same time, I do understand that resources are limited and cannot be wasted on every small claim made by the public. But this wasn't a small claim, and it was made in a manner that gave it a form of credibility. At the very least, I would have wanted to know where the woman had gotten her information from and why she had felt the need to make this claim. During the trial of Harden and Clark, multiple people provided testimony both for and against the two men. The first testimony we will take a look at came from Jeffrey Clark's ex-girlfriend, Amy. Amy testified that Clark had admitted to her that he had been into Satanism. She also testified that he had on one occasion taken her to a location in the woods in Meade County, where he had told her that he had made numerous animal sacrifices. This was apparently the same place where Rhonda Sue's body had been found. While at this location, Clark had also apparently told Amy that he had wanted to sacrifice humans as well, because it would be a challenge for him to see if he could get away with it. According to Amy, he even explained to her how someone can be killed by stabbing them at the base of their skull and severing their brainstem, which of course is what the fatal wound was in this case. Finally, she also testified that Clark owned several knives and even guns. I cannot help but wonder whether Amy ever reported any of this to the police. If my boyfriend were to take me into the woods right now and show me a spot where he had sacrificed animals, and then went on to tell me that he wanted to kill a person, and even explained to me how he would do it, I'd first of all be thinking I might be that person. But secondly, I'd be in the police station as soon as I could safely get away from him. If she ever reported this to police, it was not mentioned in any of the documents I managed to find. The defense would use an interview with Amy that was recorded not long after Rhonda Sue's murder. During this interview, a lot of Amy's testimony was not present. I personally find this quite odd. If your potentially dangerous ex-boyfriend is a suspect in a murder case, you tell the police how potentially dangerous he is as soon as you can. There was another problem with Amy's testimony, however. She had a very good reason to try and paint Clark in a bad way. Before the trial, Clark had reported Amy for sexually assaulting her own child. And from the information I could find, she was found guilty on this allegation. I could not find out how long before the trial Clark had made this report, or when her case had been investigated, went to trial, or concluded. This is not odd since it does involve a minor, and the records were most probably sealed. It does appear as though the cases might have run concurrently, which begs the question whether Clark had made the report to discredit Amy, or whether Amy had testified to discredit Clark. Of course, the possibilities also exist that both of them are telling the truth, or even that both of them could be lying. But we'll come back to this point just a bit later. Something that did stand out to me is that part of Amy's testimony was that Clark also had a tattoo of an inverted cross on his clavicle, the same tattoo as Rhonda Sue. I believe that this testimony was meant to prove that Clark and Harden had been involved in Satanism, and that this was the reason that they had given Rhonda Sue the same tattoo. Clark's parents denied that he had any such tattoo, and Clark even eventually showed his entire upper body to the jury to prove that this tattoo does not exist. Why Amy would make a claim like this when it can so easily be disproven, I do not know. But for me personally, it does cast doubt on her testimony. One of Rhonda Sue's sisters also took the stand. She would testify that she knew that Harden had been involved in Satanism, but that she had never actually seen him engage in any activities that could prove it. I could not find any information regarding why she believed that Harden had been involved in Satanism. The next testimony we will look at was delivered by a woman named Hope. Hope had claimed that she had been Rhonda Sue's best friend in the year prior to her death. According to Hope, Rhonda Sue had at some point prior to her death suspected that she may have been pregnant with Harden's child. Hope testified that upon finding out about this, that Harden had responded by telling Rhonda Sue that if she really is pregnant with his child, he would kill her. Furthermore, Hope told the court that she had on one occasion seen Rhonda Sue cut the tips of her fingers with a razor blade, and that she had then rubbed the blood from her fingers onto Harden. During cross-examination, however, Hope would say that she never saw either men partake in Satanism, and had no knowledge of him being involved in Satanism. Oh, and remember I told you earlier a woman had testified that another man had been the murderer? Well, Hope also testified that she and Rhonda Sue had met a man with that same name in the grocery store parking lot, and that they had actually spent some time hanging out with this man. Something that stood out to me here is that it seems like Hope had been with Rhonda Sue on the night of April 1. However, in no documents can I find any testimony of what time either woman left that night, or who Rhonda Sue left with, or if she even left alone. I have no doubt that this was discussed during the court case, but unfortunately none of this information made it into any document that I managed to get a hold of. Another person that would take the stand was a man named Clifford Capps. Capps had met Keith Harden in jail, as they shared a cell while awaiting trial. According to Capps, Harden had admitted to the murder of Rhonda Sue Warford not once, but twice. The first time Harden had made the confession in a joking manner, but the second time he had been entirely serious. We'll revisit this testimony a bit later as well. A friend and former co-worker of Clark also testified that Clark had always carried a knife with him. According to this friend, Clark called this his sacrificial knife. This friend also testified that Clark had previously admitted to him that he had sacrificed an animal in front of a local church, and that this even made the news. Now, I couldn't find any evidence in the court documents I managed to obtain that this story was ever verified in court. And I did try searching for news reports that supports it, but I couldn't find any. That does not mean it did not happen. If this story had made the news, it probably would have been somewhere before 1992. This means the news might not have been digitized, ever. Several people would take the stand and testify that either Clark had not been involved in Satanism, or if he was, that they were unaware of this. Detective Mike Handy would also take the stand and provide his own testimony. I couldn't find an exact account of his testimony, but instead had to compile a list of things that he had apparently testified to from a bunch of different sources during my research. So let's start with what the detective and the police as a whole had believed happened on the night of April 1, 1992. Or more accurately, early morning of April 2nd. They believed that around 12:30 a.m., approximately 30 minutes after Rhonda Sue had left her home, the two men picked her up. They then drove to the location where her body was discovered. There they had committed the attack together and then made their way back home before 4 a.m. Their travel time in this scenario would have been 2 hours, give or take, for a round trip, which means that they had about 2 hours or an hour and a half to commit the murder. So it's definitely plausible. Detective Handy also testified that Harden had admitted to him that he had been involved in satanic worship, which included the ritualistic sacrifice of animals, and that he had even said that he wanted to sacrifice a human. We'll get back to that testimony a bit later as well. For now, let's move over to the physical evidence police collected in this case. The first piece of evidence that we need to look at are the hairs that investigators found on Rhonda Sue's body at the scene. A forensic analyst testified that these hairs were similar in profile to that of Harden. In fact, he often used the word matching while on the stand. This is also a bit of important information for later on. When police found out that the hair are indeed similar to Harden's, they were convinced that he was lying about the last time he had seen Rhonda Sue. You see, Rhonda Sue's mother had told them that she had washed the red sweatpants the day before Rhonda Sue had put them on and subsequently went missing. This meant that the pants should have been clean and that the hairs discovered on them most probably came from her attacker. Another piece of evidence that made police believe both men were lying about when they last saw Rhonda Sue was the fingerprint they found in Clark's car. When asking Jeffrey Clark about it, he admitted that Rhonda Sue had been in his car on multiple occasions, but that the last time was in December of 1991, more than 4 months before her death. During the trial, the prosecution argued that the fingerprint had to have been fresh, but Harden and Clark's defense brought in an expert that testified that there is no way to determine the age of a fingerprint and that it is entirely possible that it could have been in the car for several months. This is something I do agree with, for one simple fact. Remember when you were 21? How often did you clean your car? I can definitely see a 21-year-old kid going a couple of months without cleaning their car, and a fingerprint being left in there for quite some time. I've also already mentioned the occult-related items that were found in Harden's home. Included in these items was the Satanic Bible. This, I agree with, might be weird, but I still don't see it as conclusive proof that either man were a Satanist. They may have had an interest in Satanism at some point, or someone might just have given the book to Harden as a joke, or because it's something weird. Of course, Harden having an interest in Satanism is the most plausible explanation. That still doesn't make him a murderer in my book. Forming part of the so-called occult-related items that the police had retrieved from his home was what they described as a broken chalice and a blood-stained handkerchief that was found in Harden's sink. Harden had an explanation for this. According to him, it wasn't a chalice at all. It was just a glass that had broken. The handkerchief had become bloodied when Harden tried to clean up the glass and accidentally cut himself. Detective Handy, however, had a very different idea. According to him, the chalice and handkerchief were proof that Harden had been sacrificing animals and drinking their blood. Detective Handy even went as far as testifying that Harden had admitted this to him. Now, I don't know about you, but Harden's version does make more sense to me. To prove it, I invite you to go through my trash any day. There is a bigger chance that you will find a broken glass in there than not. My boyfriend and I have stopped using glasses because we break so many of them. Now, having switched over to plastic glasses, we still somehow managed to break them. My boyfriend managed to break 3 plastic wine glasses in 3 consecutive days not too long ago. And he wasn't even drunk on any of the occasions. We're both just a bit clumsy. When Harden and Clark took the stand, their stories were quite simple. They did not murder Rhonda Sue, they did not engage in animal sacrifice, and they never admitted to the murder or any of the other allegations made against them to anyone, not to a cellmate, and definitely not to the police. On March 7, 1995, nearly 3 years after Rhonda Sue was murdered, the jury reached a verdict. Keith Harden and Jeffrey Clark were both found guilty of murder. However, the jury refused to impose the death penalty. The two men would receive sentencing on the 18th of May, but before that, something else happened. The defense team discovered a letter. The author of this letter was none other than Clifford Capps. The recipient of the letter was another incarcerated person awaiting trial alongside Capps. In the letter, Capps was trying to convince the person to also testify and say that Clark had admitted to the murder to him as well. The defense immediately brought this letter to the attention of the court, along with a motion for a retrial, and claimed that the prosecution had been aware of this letter and that they had failed to disclose it. The defense also claimed that the letter was proof that Capps had attempted to coordinate fabricated testimony. In the letter, it was also mentioned that if the recipient had testified, it would help in Capps being released on probation. Which means that this is the second testimony in the case that could have been tainted because the person providing the testimony had other legal trouble that could become considerably less problematic to them thanks to their assistance in this case. Regardless, the court found that the state did not have prior knowledge of this letter, and as such, the prosecution did not do anything wrong, and that the verdict stands. The motion for a retrial was dismissed. On the 18th of May, the men were both sentenced to life in prison. As you might have guessed by now, this is not where the case ends. Harden and Clark immediately filed an appeal. This appeal was denied. Clark then filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus on the 23rd of December 1998. A writ for habeas corpus is a court order demanding that the detained person is brought before a judge so that they can reassess their detainment to ensure that it is indeed a legal detainment. This is usually done when someone believes their rights have been violated or that police made an error during their arrest. This petition was denied on the 16th of November 1999. And again, it was appealed. I couldn't find any documentation for the original appeal or the initial petition. I did, however, find the outcome of the appeal on the habeas corpus petition. In this appeal, Clark had made several claims. His first claim was that the trial court had violated his rights by allowing the prosecution to introduce testimony that he and Harden had been involved in Satanism, although there had been no physical evidence that Rhonda Sue had been murdered in a ritualistic murder. Clark claimed that by admitting this evidence, the court had violated a Kentucky rule that prohibited evidence of someone's character being admitted for the purpose of proving that the crime is something they would do. The state in turn claimed that they did not do it to show bad character, but instead to prove that the doer's motivation was obtaining power by committing murder, which would make the testimony eligible for admission. The court made a decision. They sided with the state. They found that the testimony was indeed in regards to the men's motive, and that the state did not do anything wrong. But there is a paragraph in this finding I want to read to you. We agree with the Kentucky Supreme Court There was testimony that Clark had specifically referred to one of his knives as a, quote, sacrificial knife, and that according to satanic teachings, worshippers could empower themselves by killing other living beings. Warford's body was found with an inverted cross and wearing red sweatpants, a color which Harden acknowledged was, quote, a big color in the Satanism stuff. Although the evidence was not conclusive, it did tend to support the state's theory that Warford was killed out of a specific Satanism-related motivation for performing a human sacrifice. So, in other words, the court decided that because someone said Clark called his knife something, and because the victim had a certain tattoo and was wearing a certain color, that it was indeed a satanically motivated murder. I am not certain I truly follow the court's logic here. For me, it feels like they're either claiming that Rhonda Sue had also been involved in Satanism and that she had allowed herself to be sacrificed, which is just ridiculous. Or that the men decided to sacrifice her because she had red sweatpants on. For his second claim, Clark claimed that he was improperly joined for trial with Harden. His reasoning for this was that most of the evidence of Satanism was entered against Harden and not against Clark. Remember the occult-related items? Well, they were all found in Harden's possession and not Clark's. The same for the threat that Harden had allegedly made against Rhonda Sue when she suspected she might have been pregnant. Clark was basically saying that he was found guilty by association, an opinion that 2 out of 7 Supreme Court justices agreed with. I also just want to note here that I never found any mention of Rhonda Sue actually having been pregnant at the time of her death. Abortion was legal in the state of Kentucky at that time, but I'm also quite certain that if Rhonda Sue had indeed had an abortion, it would have come up in court as proof of her fear of Harden and his threat. Clark's final claim went back to the letter that Capps had written. Now, this letter is quite important actually. After the trial, jury members admitted that Capps's testimony had indeed carried weight, which means if the letter was found before the trial finalized, he could have been discredited and the jury might have returned a different verdict. Even the Kentucky Supreme Court described this statement as the most incriminating statement. Once again, though, the court found that the prosecution had no prior knowledge of this letter, and as such, that it is not grounds for a new trial once again. Here is the issue with the letter, though. Clark had entered sworn affidavits in which it was claimed that the recipient of the letter had told a public defender that he had actually shown this letter to Sheriff Greer, a sheriff who was actively involved in the investigation. In fact, Clark managed to get affidavits from 3 attorneys, 2 of which were public defenders and the third a prosecutor, all of whom were working on another case where Capps and the recipient of that letter were involved as witnesses. In their affidavits, all 3 attorneys swore that Sheriff Greer had verbally acknowledged that he had a copy of this letter. Sheriff Greer, however, entered an affidavit saying that he had no prior knowledge of the letter. He also made a statement in which he denied ever speaking to the recipient of the letter. The recipient himself entered an affidavit saying that he had never given Sheriff Greer a copy of this letter. Another person, Deputy Sheriff Cliff Wise, who was also involved in the investigation, entered an affidavit in which he claimed that he had spoken to Sheriff Greer multiple times about the case. According to him, Sheriff Greer had told him that Capps had given a statement, but that the recipient of the letter refused to speak to the sheriff. This claim was also supported by a number of staff from the Breckinridge County Clerk's office, who also entered affidavits claiming that Sheriff Greer had never spoken to the recipient and that he had never had a copy of the letter. In the end, this appeal made by Clark also failed. The men, however, did not give up. They followed every avenue they could for the following 10 years and kept on insisting that they were innocent. Then, in 2009, something happened that will have an impact on this case. You see, back in 1993, just a few weeks before Detective Handy testified in Harden and Clark's case, saying that there were confessions of satanic involvement and animal sacrifice from the men, Detective Handy was working on another case. And due to his reputation, he closed that case by obtaining a confession from a man named Edwin Chandler. This confession and Handy's testimony about it was instrumental in seeing Chandler found guilty on manslaughter charges. But in 2009, evidence surfaced that showed Handy had given a false testimony in this case, especially regarding the supposed confession, and subsequently, Edwin Chandler was exonerated. This was the break that Harden and Clark had been waiting for. If Detective Handy could lie and commit perjury in one case, how many other cases could he have done it in? Suddenly, his reputation went from solving hard cases by getting confessions to falsifying confessions in order to solve hard cases. Coincidentally, in 2009, the Innocence Project took on Harden and Clark's case. Now, I can't find out exactly what the timeline of events were here, but I'm almost certain that the revelation of Detective Handy being a dirty cop would have been the deciding factor. There was finally enough doubt for someone to believe that the two men who had been claiming innocence all this time was actually innocent. The first step in trying to prove her innocence was to petition a court to do a DNA comparison on the hair that was found on Rhonda Sue's body to both Harden and Clark. A court denied this petition, stating that even if the hairs did not match, it would not prove that Harden and Clark were innocent, only that a third person was involved. After this, a complaint was filed on Harden's behalf. This complaint alleged that Sheriff Greer had actively been involved in corrupting the case against Harden and Clark by conspiring with Clark's ex-girlfriend, Amy. Sheriff Greer had allegedly convinced Amy to testify to Clark's interest in Satanism as well as animal and human sacrifice in return for a reduced sentence in the case regarding her abuse against her son. I could not find an exact copy of his complaint or any information regarding who made this complaint, and I would assume that this is because it is still part of an ongoing case that we'll get to in just a bit. Some more information regarding Sheriff Greer came forward as well. Apparently, it was he who offered Clifford Capps leniency in his pending case if he testified against Harden and Clark. This meant that two more of the most damning testimonies against the men, and Clark specifically, was tainted by corruption. Suddenly, the case against the two men started to fall apart almost 20 years after their arrest. The Innocence Project started pushing harder for all the evidence in this case to be retested and re-examined. This included the hair, as well as the blood on the handkerchief that Detective Handy claimed to have been animal blood. The state and prosecution attempted to fight this retesting of the evidence all the way. The appeals eventually landed up in the Kentucky High Court, and in 2013, the court finally ruled in favor of the men and the Innocence Project by allowing the DNA evidence to be retested. During his ruling, the Supreme Court Justice who finally granted this motion looked directly at the prosecutor and asked him, quote, "Why would you just not give them a DNA test?" The tests would finally happen in 2014. When the blood on the handkerchief was tested, it was a match to Harden. This supported his initial testimony that the glass had just been a normal glass which he had accidentally broken, and the bloody handkerchief was a result of him cutting himself while trying to clean it up. The hairs found on Rhonda Sue's pants were also tested. Now, remember I told you that a woman had given testimony that it was actually another man who had killed Rhonda Sue, and Rhonda Sue's friend Hope had even said that they had met a man with the same name in the parking lot and had spent time with him. Well, these hairs were tested against Rhonda Sue, Harden, Clark, and this other man. None of them was a match. Oh, and don't forget that an analyst had testified that the hairs were a match to Harden's hair profile. But we'll get to that again in a while. Armed with proof of corrupt officers and the new test results of the physical evidence, which now actually supported Harden and Clark, the Kentucky Attorney General agreed to re-examine their case. In February of 2015, the Innocent Project lawyers filed a motion for a new trial. They presented the evidence that Detective Handy had falsely testified against Edwin Chandler and that Edwin Chandler had been exonerated afterwards. They also provided evidence showing that in another 1992 murder investigation, Detective Handy had erased a witness's recorded statement and then proceeded to record over it. He then also lied about this in the pre-trial hearing of that case. Finally, on the 14th of July 2016, Meade County Circuit Court Judge Bruce Butler vacated the men's convictions. The judge said that the convictions had been based on false evidence and false arguments. Now, while this must have been a joyous moment for Harden and Clark, I want you to think of Rhonda Sue's family. For over 20 years, they had believed that Rhonda Sue had received justice. And now suddenly, thanks to the action of corrupt cops, this justice was taken away from them. They had to deal with the fact that either the state had gotten it wrong 20 years ago, and Rhonda Sue's killer had been walking around free all that time, or that now suddenly her killers may have found a way to get themselves off the hook. Either way, I can only imagine what her family had had to go through it again. Remember, Harden and Clark would not just be released. The entire trial would have to be redone. This would mean that everyone involved in the initial trial would need to testify again, including Rhonda Sue's family. They thought that they would need to sit through it all again and hear the horrific details of their loved one's death. I couldn't find any mention of her family after the initial trial, and I couldn't find enough information to try and contact them. So I have no idea how this actually impacted them. In August of 2016, Harden and Clark were both released on bond. For the first time in over 20 years, these men saw the outside world. The prosecution immediately appealed their release, which once again went all the way up to a grand jury, which eventually upheld the release. In response to this, the prosecution added further charges against the men. These charges included the kidnapping of Rhonda Sue and accusing Jeffrey Clark of perjury. The perjury charges against Clark was based on his testimony the year prior in a hearing to determine whether he should be granted a new trial. Clark was asked if he had ever confessed to murdering Rhonda Sue. Clark said no, he had never done so. The state claimed that this was a lie, because in a 2006 parole hearing, Clark testified that he had helped to move Rhonda Sue's body after her murder. Now just take a moment and imagine that you had been in prison for 14 years already for a crime you did not commit. Now suddenly, you are given an opportunity to get out, to see the outside world and have some sort of freedom again. The problem is that the only way to do so is to admit to the crime, even if you didn't commit it. If you continue claiming innocence, you are assured you will never receive parole. But by admitting to being involved, saying you're sorry, and you will never do that again, it gives you the chance to be free. After 14 years? Keeping in mind as well that in 2006, all their petitions and appeals so far had failed, and the Innocence Project had not yet been involved. This was the only sliver of hope that Clark could see for freedom. So I'm not surprised that he made this so-called confession to the parole board. And Judge Butler had actually already agreed with me by this time. You see, when he granted the men a new trial, he already dismissed this testimony of Clark as holding no legal relevance, due to the fact that it is well known that prisoners need to acknowledge their crime if they want to be awarded parole, even if they are innocent. The extra charges that the prosecution had filed against the men had also meant that the death penalty was back on the table. In December of 2016, Harden and Clark's teams filed a motion to dismiss the extra charges, claiming that the state had only filed them out of vindictive retaliation at the men for exercising their legal right to attack their murder convictions. In August of 2017, the Kentucky Supreme Court again affirmed the trial court ruling for a new trial and stated that it found little merit in Clark's statements to the parole board, calling them, quote, insincere and contrived admissions induced solely by the yearning to be free, end quote. In January of the following year, Judge Butler dismissed the new charges and also branded them as vindictive prosecution. The next month, the Kentucky Attorney General's Office of Special Prosecution filed a motion to dismiss the remaining murder indictments, citing the discredited physical evidence as well as the evidence relating to Detective Handy's misconduct. This motion was granted by Judge Butler on the 26th of February 2018. Harden and Clark were finally free. But their story still does not end there. in 2021, Detective Mike Handy pled guilty to perjury and evidence tampering in regards to his testimony in the Chandler case, as well as the witness statement he had recorded over. He received only a 1-year sentence. In September of 2023, Clark and Hardin reached a settlement on their federal lawsuit against their local government and the officers. This settlement was for the amount of $20.5 million. They basically received $1 million for each year that they had spent in prison. Hardin and Clark went on to lay charges against a whole list of people involved in this case. This included Robert Furman, the forensic serologist whom had initially testified that the hairs were a match to Hardin. Furman petitioned the court for a summary judgment on the charges against him. A summary judgment is when the defendant asks the court to look at all the evidence against them in order to dismiss the charges for not being strong enough to obtain a conviction. Furman was granted his summary judgment on all but one claim. You see, somewhere along the line, Hardin and Clark had discovered Furman's observation notes. These are the notes he made prior to making his final conclusion on whether the hairs were a match to them or not. Although his end conclusion was that the hairs had matched at least one of them, his observation notes had been saying exactly the opposite. The men felt that these notes were supposed to be disclosed during the initial trial, but the court found that the observation notes do not need to be disclosed, only the final conclusion. I could not find any information on what the remaining claim against Furman is, but as far as I can determine, that case is still ongoing. Also included in the additional charges that Hardin and Clark filed are Sheriff Joseph Greer, Deputy Cliff Weiss, and Coroner William Adams. These men also filed for a summary judgment. The judge returned a granted in part and denied in part decision on this summary judgment. This meant that some of the claims that Hardin and Clark filed had been dismissed due to a lack of evidence, but that the core of their lawsuit against these men would continue to be heard before a jury. The claims that were dismissed included the following. Hardin and Clark claimed that Sheriff Greer had fed Clark's ex-girlfriend Amy information to get her to falsely testify against him. This claim was dismissed because the judge found no concrete evidence to this beyond mere speculation. Hardin and Clark also claimed that Deputy Weiss failed to stop Sheriff Greer from fabricating Amy's testimony, but because the claim of fabrication was thrown out, this claim was also thrown out. The final claim that was thrown out was against Meade County itself. Hardin and Clark claimed that Sheriff Greer's actions represented an official policy of Meade County. While the judge threw this claim out, he did allow Hardin and Clark to pursue a separate claim against the county for failing to train their officers. As for the claims that were permitted to continue, they are as follows. The first is a Brady violation, or in layman's terms, hiding of evidence that could have proven their innocence. This claim is based on the letter written by Capps. The judge finally found that there is enough of a dispute regarding whether Sheriff Greer and Deputy Weiss had known about the letter prior to the original trial and actively attempted to hide it in order to not discredit Capps as a witness. The next claim I found extremely interesting. It wasn't until I discovered this document from last year but I heard about this claim. Horden and Clark claimed that the coroner and Sheriff Greer had changed Rhonda Sue's date of death. According to the claim, the date of death was initially noted as the 4th of April, the day before Rhonda Sue's body was discovered. However, Horden and Clark both had alibis for the 4th of April. Then, the date of death was changed to the 2nd of April, a day for which the men did not have alibis. The judge found that there was enough evidence, which included the coroner and medical examiner's reports, to allow this claim to go to trial and be decided by a jury. The next claim goes back to the letter that Capps had written. Horden and Clark claimed that Greer and Wise had helped to fabricate the confession that Capps claimed he had heard in jail. The judge allowed this claim to continue based on the letter itself, as well as Clark denying that he had ever spoken to Capps. The next claim is one of malicious prosecution. Horden and Clark claims that Sheriff Greer initiated criminal prosecution against them without probable cause. They quote the fabricated evidence and testimony in this claim. The final claim is one of conspiracy. Clark and Horden claim that Greer, Wise, and Adams all conspired together to frame them. They quoted the change of death, the hidden letter, and the fact that the men all had to work together to make this happen as evidence for this. The judge found that a jury could reasonably infer that these men had a single plan to violate Clark and Harden's rights. In other words, he thinks a jury might actually find them guilty on this claim. Like I said, the judge's response on this summary judgment was released just last year. This means that the case against these three men still need to be heard in court. And of course, it means that all the claims made against them here and earlier on in the podcast are alleged claims and have not yet been proven. I'll keep an eye out for more information on the ongoing proceedings, and I'll add any updates there might be into future cases. While Horden and Clark are busy fighting for their own form of justice, it is important that we remember that Rhonda Sue and her family never got justice. The wrongful conviction of Horden and Clark overshadowed the death of Rhonda Sue Warford in such a way that she almost feels like an afterthought in every article, court document, or podcast I used in research for this case. Rhonda Sue was only 19 years old at the time of her death. Had she still been alive now, she would have been around the age of 52. She would probably have had children by now, and perhaps even grandchildren. She might even have already been considering her retirement plans by now. But she never had the opportunity. And instead of receiving justice for her death, she is now only a footnote in the injustice against two other people. I cannot help but wonder if the investigating officers did not jump at the claims of Satanism and the easy conviction that it meant, whether her actual murderer would have been caught instead of sending two innocent men to prison for half of their lives. If the police actually cared about investigating her murder, instead of just getting a conviction, any conviction, but there might actually have been true justice for her. I also wonder if her killer went on to offend again. Did the poor investigation into her murder cost someone else their life? While I hold out hope that Rhonda Sue's killer will someday be brought to justice, for now, it's important that we remember her and that we ensure Rhonda Sue did not lose her life in vain. Remember when I spoke earlier about legacies? Well, for me personally, Rhonda Sue's legacy could be a strong reminder that we should not always get stuck in the first and easiest explanation we can come up with, such as satanic rituals, for example, but rather that police should do their jobs thoroughly and explore every avenue. And maybe, by remembering Rhonda Sue's case, it could help to ensure that a future victim gets actual justice instead of sending more innocent people to prison. Rhonda Sue, rest in peace. You will be remembered. Now, I know that many people do not like hearing unsolved cases. That's natural, because we as humans like to have closure. We want to see everything bad come to an end, with a neat little bow on them. But this does not always happen. And I want you to take a moment and think about it. If you do not even like to listen to unsolved cases, what must the family members of these victims in unsolved cases feel like? I'd like to encourage you to pick up a copy of Nicole Engelbrecht's new book, Bare Bones. Nicole is the host of True Crime South Africa, and the book focuses on unsolved cases that she had covered on her own podcast. The book is definitely worth the read, especially since Nicole has contact with the family members in each case. I'll see you again next week. Until then, be safe, wicked listeners.